National Relations and Cooperation Minister Dr. Naledi Pandor says she hopes the conflict between Russia and Ukraine can be resolved through diplomacy. She's hosting her Russian counterpart, Sergey Lavrov, in Tshwane this morning. Newzroom Afrika's ZiyandaNgcobo is in the capital and attended the introductory remarks that were said a little earlier. Ziyanda, good morning to you once again. Interesting comments coming from the Russian foreign minister, who says his country is in favor of peaceful negotiations when it comes to the Ukrainian situation or Ukrainian conflict. What more did he have to say?
Strong comments coming then from the foreign minister, Russian foreign minister Sergey Lavrov, basically saying that they've always been open to a negotiation and a settlement between themselves and Russia, and that in fact it was the Americans and Britain and others in the West who convinced then Ukraine not to negotiate with Russia. In fact, he even gave a short timeline, even going as far back as September last year, when he claims that Russia wanted to enter into negotiations. It's coming up to a year on the 24th of February since then Russia invaded Ukraine. It will be a year since that conflict took place. In fact, I was reading a report just yesterday that Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky has been actually requesting from Germany military tankers to actually be sent, and Germany hasn't quite confirmed whether or not they'll be sending more artillery to be able to continue with the conflict, since Russia has now basically taken over most of the eastern parts of Ukraine. So, it was our own minister, Dr. Naledi Pandor, who fired the first salvo to say that it's always been South Africa's stance then to use and have a peaceful, use diplomacy and dialogue to resolve a conflict as per the UN charters, and nothing has changed in that regard. So very interesting comments coming from the Russian foreign minister here today, given just how things are still taking place in Ukraine.
The other element here, Ziyanda, is what was said by our Minister of Foreign Affairs, if you like, who says that, or basically wanting to use this platform to highlight what she says are many conflicts on the African continent that have gone in a way almost unnoticed in the global sphere. That's something very interesting, isn't it? Because she's well aware that the reason for so much interest by media on this particular visit by Sergey Lavrov, it is to highlight the Ukrainian conflict. But she's saying many of the conflicts that are still ongoing on the continent of Africa are not being noticed by the world. Why do you think she did that?
So, there's many ways to look at it. The first is the fact that African countries are largely underrepresented when it comes to these multilateral platforms such as the United Nations. That's why you would have heard then Lavrov mentioning, underrepresentation in the UN Security Council of developing countries. So it's not a new issue when it comes to African countries raising this, and particular, even via the African Union. There's been that continued conflict in Ethiopia. There's also been continued conflict by the M23 rebels entering, the DRC through Rwanda. There are several conflicts on the continent that, as you've mentioned and as the minister mentioned, have not been getting attention from the rest of the world. However, there's always been an issue of the interference of the bigger countries such as the West and NATO in conflict on the African continent, and that's precisely why then there was a specific mention of specific spheres, that this bilateral meeting was hoping to achieve, including only energy. You know that Russia has a significant hydrocarbon energy, and we are still dealing with our own energy crisis here in the country. Also very important about this particular bilateral is also to really talk about bolstering economic relations, even though know, South Africa is the only African country on BRICS, and Dr. Pandor acknowledging how the country has benefited from the developmental bank, the BRICS Developmental Bank. The West, in particular, the European Union and the US still remain South Africa's largest trade partners, and this is actually something for countries that have had diplomatic relations for 31 years now, is something that both countries agree needs to be bolstered. So yes, the issue of conflicts on the continent is one that is important, but I think most of the focus today will be bolstering that, given the fact that there's a new scramble for Africa, Oli. The West has been trying to counter the influence of China on the continent, and Russia being part of, the BRICS formation is very important that it too, via bilateral talks such as these, bolsters those relations. And there's going to be a BRICS Head of State Summit that's going to be hosted by South Africa in August, and perhaps we'll have another Lula moment, seeing that he's returned as the Brazilian president later on this year.
And very interesting indeed, Ziyanda, that you mentioned the scramble for Africa by the globe, and you have the Treasury Secretary of the United States, Janet Yellen, who also is expected in the country this week. But let's conclude the conversation around what this meeting, or at least the introductory remarks, have also flagged, and that is what Naledi Pandor refers to as the democratization of the United Nations body. But Sergey Lavrov went further to accentuate exactly what the problem is at the Security Council. What did he say?
So it's basically the issue of the fact that, a lot of the time there's been underrepresentation of African countries, in particular in bodies such as the UN Security Council. And I think he specifically mentioned that because even when you're talking about the Russia-Ukraine conflict, the UN Security Council hasn't actually taken a resolution insofar as this conflict is concerned. And it's something that South Africa has consistently highlighted when being pressurized and being asked about why it's taken a neutral stance when it comes to this conflict. Others have accused, this government, our South African government, of being narrow-looking insofar as its fraternal relations with the ANC and that of United Russia at a party political level as opposed to on a global scale. So Lavrov really highlighting looking forward to the South African presidency in BRICS, especially in the context of developments in finance. And I think, as I've mentioned, this is going to be critical and going to underpin then, the geopolitical tensions and how they are managed, which is something that our own Dr. Naledi Pandor mentioned, that there need to be mechanisms and the bolstering of mechanisms such as BRICS. And you'll know, Oli, that there's now a push to actually have more countries added onto BRICS, and that will be part of the discussions at the summit in August here in South Africa later this year. And this will obviously shift and tip the scales, and it's part of why then, we're coming up to a year in dealing with this Russia-Ukraine conflict, and Lavrov basically saying that it's the West that's been interrupting what was meant to be something that could have been resolved between the two countries. That's in essence what he said here this morning.
ZiyandaNgcobo, thank you very much for that update. Live for us in Pretoria.